Oline, and salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. This is, of course, yours truthfully, recording on August 15th, 2021. And I'm here to invite you to consider with me how David Icke views my work. So to begin, I'm going to say something about professional etiquette. So when an author writes a book that requires research and citations from other authors, it is normal to name the authors cited, whether they are quoted verbatim especially, or whether there is some reference from the work of the author which is not original to the writer who is citing the author. And of course, I've done this many times in the books that I've written. There are, I think, 240 footnotes in Not in His Image? Professional etiquette requires that quoting someone, you name who you're quoting. If you repeat their words verbatim, you cite them so that the reader does not think that the words you are writing are original to you. And likewise, even if you refer to someone, for instance, if I'm reading a book on Mithraism by Franz Cumont, and he proposes a certain viewpoint on the subject, or he offers an insight, and I repeat that in my writing, then I refer to the author or scholar who originally stated the insight or proposition that I develop. And I make it clear that I am drawing from the work of someone else. Likewise, in speaking, public speaking, or recorded speaking on the internet, the same thing applies. Professional etiquette, if you choose to follow it, obligates you to name someone that you are citing as you speak. Failure to do so misleads the reader or the listener. It puts them in a position of assuming that what you say is original to yourself, when in fact it's drawn from another source. Here are a couple of examples. As far as I know, it's fair to say that I am the main agent who introduced the term archon into open discourse on the internet. I brought it through the Overton window and presented it to the world when? Back in 2002 on metahistory.org. And since then, I have spoken and written a considerable amount of material about the archons, always keeping, according to my discipline, within the frame of the Gnostic narrative of Sophia. So I've told the story of the archons many times, and I have identified the archons in one respect with the so-called gray aliens, and I have elaborated on the motivation and operations of the archons with reference to ET UFO phenomena, and I've done it extensively. But I was not the first individual to make that connection. When I was in London in summer of 1999, I was heading back to Belgium, and I went by Piccadilly Circus, as I often did, and went to Hatcher's bookstore and perused some books to buy and bring back with me to Belgium. One of those books was The Song of the Greys by Nigel Kerner. This book came out in 1999, and apparently it's a rather rare item these days. If you want to use paperback of it, you have to pay $978 on Amazon. Well, in that book, Corneille cited certain Gnostic texts. He didn't cite them extensively as I do, but he referred to the Nag Hammadi writings, and he made the link between gray ETs and the archons described in those Gnostic materials. He was the first one who did that, and I have credited him with that numerous times in writing and speaking. Another example, take just a phrase, a striking phrase. For instance, if I said to you, one way to regard the ET UFO phenomenon is, rather than to consider it to be true or untrue, consider it to be a spiritual control program. Well, I could say that, and I could write it down in a book, and I have. And you might come across that and you might think, John said something remarkable there. The ET UFO phenomenon is a spiritual control program. I think I'll look into that. In other words, even if I take interest in it, no matter what I think about it, in some way, it is a mind control program that works on me, perhaps in ways that I don't detect. Really important observation. Well, I've cited that phrase numerous times, and I have credited it to Jacques Vallee, so that you do not mistake me as the original author of that statement. Another example is the phrase, a kind of messianic science fiction. So if I'm talking to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I say, well, in the view of the 20th or 21st century, when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly at certain passages, say, in the so-called Thanksgiving hymns, it appears as if those scrolls describe something you could call a kind of messianic science fiction. Now, again, this is a striking phrase, which I've quoted, but in doing so, I attribute it to someone else, so that you know that it is not originally my language. And I would do that if I used it in speaking or writing. That's professional etiquette. Now, the trick about professional etiquette is, you know if someone, a writer or speaker, is applying it, but you don't know if they're not. So someone could say something on a YouTube talk that could actually be taken from someone else, and they would pass it off as if it were their own words, their own idea, uniquely the fruit of their own studies and research. And that is dishonest in my mind, in my view. Now, I don't make the rules for anyone. And at the end of the day, I really don't care whether someone observes the rules of professional etiquette or not. But when it comes to Gnostic intel, I do have some skin in the game. So I'm going to make an observation about some things that David Icke has said and written. For the purposes of background or context in this talk, I'm providing a link to an excerpt from David Icke, which is found on a YouTube channel called Johnny Bigger. And this channel, whoever runs this channel, tends to extract things from David Icke's talks and put them on as the voiceover to a montage which he presents. So there is a link to a recent upload by Johnny Bigger. And in this upload, David Icke talks about the archons, as he often does. In fact, some of you may be aware that some years ago, when Icke was doing his world tour, He gave a 6 or 7 hour talk at Wembley Auditorium. And in the course of that talk, he devoted, I think, almost a full half hour to Nag Hammadi, the Gnostics, and the Archons. And in the course of that talk, where he cited materials and texts by name, which I have also cited extensively in Not in His Image and elsewhere, he continually uses the phrase, the Gnostics said. But in fact, that is not accurate. Almost all of what he says in those 20-25 minutes is not what the Gnostics said exactly, but it's exactly what I said that the Gnostics said. And there is a difference. To make this difference clear, let me tell you this. To some extent in my writings and talks, I have attempted to say accurately what the Gnostics said based on actual passages which you can find and cite. So I quote them verbatim, and I always cite the passage that I'm using. And in those instances, I attempt at my very best to represent them fairly and not say something that they didn't say, but to speak as closely as possible to the remaining evidence of what they did say. But I don't only do that. There are many more instances in which I elaborate and extrapolate on what the Gnostics said. And in those cases, you would be wrong if you thought that you could go back into the surviving ancient materials and find verbatim what I say, because I am, in fact, developing and elaborating according to my view, my rendering of the Gnostic intel. And most of what I say about it falls into the second category. So what I have done, to be honest, and that's obvious to anyone, I think, is that I have upgraded and updated the Gnostic intel, and I have said things that the Gnostics themselves did not say, but I have brought the Gnostic intel forward so that it speaks to the world through me today in an appropriate way, in a relevant way for our times. This is what I've done. But anyone who stands in front of several thousand people in an auditorium and keeps repeating the phrase, the Gnostics said this, and the Gnostics said that, who does not openly cite another author as the source of those exact expressions, is being dishonest. Or to put it more kindly, not observing professional etiquette. You will hear an example of this behavior in the excerpt that I link in the description. At one point, David Icke says that about 1/5 of the Gnostic material is devoted to a discussion of the Archons. Well, how did he determine that? Did he compile all the material and do a word count and then separate the passages that refer to the Archons and do a little calculation of the word count in order to arrive at the figure of 20%, so that he could say confidently, casually, about 1/5 of the material discusses the Archons? Well, maybe he did. But I also said that in Not in His Image 15 years ago. So what do you make of that? I don't know, because you're not in front of me to answer. You might think, well, what difference does it make? Or you might think that I'm on a jag because of an ego problem that I have about being recognized. And you might think any number of other things as well. But the reality is, my friends, that the attention that comes to me, insofar as it comes to me as an individual scholar, and may in some way have a bearing upon my egotistical investment in what I do, if you want to call it that, that attention that comes to me goes to the source. It goes to the Aeon Sophia. So in fact, your attention to me goes to her, and that's what I'm here for. I consider it a matter of high importance that the attention that goes to the Aeon Sophia, the Aeonic Mother, goes to her in the correct way. The Gnostic intel is extremely powerful and unique, and it needs to be handled skillfully and carefully. And I am rigorous about how that's done. So I consider it my responsibility, I make it my responsibility to critique those who handle the Gnostic intel, a lot of which comes from me, whether they cite me as the origin or not, when I detect that they are handling it wrongly. Now, David Icke falls into that class, as do a number of other people, including my former friend and colleague, Graham Hancock. So in concluding this talk, I'd like to point out to you an example, an outstanding example of what I consider to be a wrong way to handle the Gnostic intel on the archons. I'll confine my remarks to two issues. The first issue you can hear illustrated in this extract. At a certain moment, David Icke says that the Gnostics said that we are living in a simulation. Well, that is not true. They did not say that in any surviving texts from Nag Hammadi or elsewhere. I myself have never said that or written anything like that. And in fact, I have exerted considerable effort to warn you about that interpretation of the Gnostic message. So I challenge David Icke or anyone else to cite a passage literally from Nag Hammadi where it says in the text that we here on earth, in the natural world, are living in a simulation created by the archons. I challenge anyone to cite that text. There is no such text, and they never said that. Now, there is a word in the Coptic language, I've written about it often, Hal, H-A-L, and it means virtual reality or simulation. You could say the exact literal translation is the power of simulation. And the archons do have that power, but they cannot and did not ever apply it to produce a complete simulation of the natural world. The natural world in which you live, the earth upon which you stand, the total environment, the air you breathe, the sun, the moon, and the stars are not an archontic simulation. And it is wrong to say or to imply that they are. Here again, on this point, I have the opportunity to demonstrate professional etiquette. One of the authors that I cite in Not in His Image, and I think maybe not in His Image, but certainly on the writings of metahistory.org, which are now found on Nemata, I cite a man called Stephan Hurler. And he is a Gnostic teacher who lived in Los Angeles. He had a school on Los Feliz Avenue, not far from Manly Palmer Hall's big library and study center. And I used to go there often. And I actually met Stephan Hurler, Hoeller, at his house somewhere out in Laguna Beach. I don't know. So I know the man. And in a book that he wrote on Gnosticism, he made a really important point. He said that if you look closely at the texts, at the original source materials, you'll find that the Gnostics made a distinction, sharp distinction, between Gaia, or Gay in Greek, which converts into Kaz in Coptic, K-A-Z, which is Earth, the environment of the Earth, the biosphere, and cosmos. So Kaz, the Earth, and cosmos are not the same. And they use the word cosmos to refer to archontic simulation. I maintain that the best translation, most accurate translation of the word cosmos in this particular context, with this particular Gnostic spin, is system. So the Earth is the Earth. It's real. It's totally real. It's not an illusion. It's not a simulation. It is the living body of the Aeon Sophia, as the Gnostic narrative explains. But simultaneously, living upon the Earth, human animals also face the risk of being entrained and entrapped in a system, the system of archontic simulation. The Earth is not a simulation, but the archons attempt to impose a simulation upon the Earth. They attempt to impose their version of reality upon the material, sensory, perceptible world. So you could say that they warned that we are living in two worlds at once. One is real and genuine, the biosphere of the Earth, and the other is an archontic trap, a matrix. Now, I am indebted to Stephan Hurler for highlighting this distinction between cause and cosmos, and I credit him as the originator of that insight. When I came across it in one of his books, I found it extremely helpful. It's possible that my own studies might eventually have led me to that precise insight, but it was through someone else that I learned that. And according to the code of professional etiquette that I follow, I'm happy to say who it was that showed me that point. So I consider it wrong. It could be either due to ignorance, or it could be due to deliberate deceit or omission or intention to mislead. I'm not ascribing motive to David Icke. He falls into a gang of many others who claim that this world, meaning the natural world that you live in, is a simulation. And I've expended quite a bit of time to refute that view, which I can do in one simple question. In order for there to be a simulation, there must be an original object that is simulated. Or to put it in another way, in order to have a holographic projection of an apple, which is a really good example of archontic simulation using AI, you have to have a real, genuine, original apple. So the way to construct a holographic projection and produce a simulation of an apple, the technique, the technology, requires a real, original apple. So if this world, the natural world, life on Earth, is a simulation of what? Is it a simulation? What does it simulate? What does it replicate? You see? So Hal is the ability to simulate, to replicate. This is the signature of the archons. They are a mimetic species, just like AI, which should properly be known as archontic intelligence and not artificial intelligence, because there's no such thing as artificial intelligence. All true intelligence is natural and alive and not artificial. But that key distinction from Stephen Hurler between cos and cosmos always helps to separate the archontic factor in human reality from the natural factor. And you see that today demonstrated in, for example, the threat coming from the World Economic Forum that they will create a technocratic utopia in which your digital identity is the same as your personal identity as a living animal. Well, that would be the triumph of the archons in a certain sense, because they would have superimposed Hal, a virtual reality, over the actual living reality of your experience. And that indeed is what they are attempting to do now as they reach the consummation of their works. Finally, the second issue I want to cover goes again to David Icke and others like Graham Hancock, who give their rendering of what the Gnostics said, right? And in doing so, they always demonstrate an omission. They omit the Aeon Sophia. In fact, I have rarely heard, I don't know if I've ever heard, David Icke or Graham Hancock or Greg Braden and others who interpret the Gnostic intel to the world. I don't know if I've ever heard them mention her name. Now, she is the central figure in the Gnostic message. And the sacred narrative, the fallen goddess scenario, says that she morphed into the earth. She is in what I call material immanence. So the entire natural world is the garment or body, to be exact, the dream body of the Aeon Sophia. But have you ever heard David Icke or anyone else mention that? And why don't they mention that? Why don't they include that part of the Gnostic message when they stand before the world or write books presuming to represent what the Gnostics taught? Why not? They are omitting the most important part of the Gnostic message. Well, perhaps they don't say anything about her because they don't know her and love her. And in order to speak about the Aeon Sophia, your divine mother, that is a requirement. Feeling her presence, feeling that you are in her presence constantly, that you were born into it and die into it, is fundamental to knowing anything about her. So there is a profound empathic factor in the living gnosis today. I try to communicate that in the best way I can whenever I try to translate or render in terms that would matter in the world today what those ancient shamans and seers actually said. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.